Good evening, and thank you again for coming. And I'm glad that Marcus is able to join us. I wasn't able to join you last week. Sister Jean Reed told me it was fabulous. So I'm looking forward to another wonderful evening. So, Marcus, take it away.
Thank you, Sis Maria. I appreciate it. And I'm so glad that we get to be together again. I know we covered a lot of ground last week and we moved very quickly. So I promised, I think Sister Jean had a great recommendation to save those questions from the end of last time and maybe use them to get started today. I think that was very smart. So we'll do just a real quick recap, and then I look forward to hearing what folks have been thinking about since our time together last week. So, as we go deeper into the joy of love, as you recall, last week we talked through some of the context for Amoris Laetitia, both the synods that happened in 2014 and 2015, and then also some of the documents that have come before Amoris Laetitia that lay the groundwork for what Pope Francis has to say, in particular in the third chapter, which we'll dive into tonight. And so last time we just talked about chapter 1, so we can go over maybe some of the highlights and then hear what you've been thinking about since last week. And then tonight we will sink our teeth into chapters 2 and 3. So, as you may remember from last week, this opening chapter of Amoris Laetitia is entitled In the Light of the Word, where Pope Francis turns to Scripture to talk about how families are central to God's story, the way in which marriage reflects the triune God who is love, and the emphasis on begetting and raising children. That an important objective for marriage is procreation. Although if you took time to read chapter 2, you'll notice that Pope Francis acknowledges that the church has maybe overemphasized procreation as an important dimension of marriage. And at the same time laments that there are more and more couples who are choosing not to have children. So hopefully we can circle back to that. I think for my purposes, especially as a moral theologian, the paragraphs on families as a center of formation is something that I think really bears special emphasis for folks in the church, especially in our very hyper-individualistic culture in the United States, where I think too often we imagine discipleship through an individual lens. We think about my relationship with Jesus or how I emulate Jesus, but I don't know that we really take seriously, that Jesus called people into relationship with one another. He didn't call one disciple, he called 12 disciples, and he called them into community with one another. And those relationships are absolutely central. Like, for example, we recently heard the story of doubting Thomas. And I really struggle with that story because just about every time, we get to the homily, you hear the same things about, doubting Thomas, and, seeing is sometimes the way to believe, but it's even better if you can believe without seeing. And I gotta say, I'm with Thomas. If the disciples encounter the risen Christ and they're still hiding in fear in a locked room, I don't buy it. I mean, the disciples are not transformed. They're not, encouraged to go out into the street. That they're unchanged, and so I think Thomas gets a bad rap, and I don't know why the disciples were still, cowering in fear and locked in a room, but maybe it was groupthink or the diffusion of responsibility. I don't know, how we can explain it, but I think, Thomas is pointing to all of us to say we have to be radically transformed into, as St. Paul says, a new creation. The resurrection is not a historical event; it's a cosmic event that makes all things new. And so I think, tonight we're going to look at in chapter 2 kind of the state of family life. And while it's important to read the signs of the times, and that's the first step in the see, judge, act process is to really look at things as they are in a clear-eyed way. That's important, yes, but we don't have to settle for the way things are. And I think if we took seriously the way in which family should be the center of formation, that means always stretching our imagination of what more is possible, especially knowing that we can always rely on grace. That is always calling and enabling us to be God's partners in the world. Something I say to my students all the time is God wants partners, not puppets, which is to say we've got to exercise our free will and roll up our sleeves and get to work. And I think a lot of times when people look at the family, and there's so much that's been written about families in crisis, we focus too much on the ways that families have been acted upon by society. And chapter 2 certainly looks at the ways in which families are impacted by sinful social structures. And that's true, but it's only half the story. Families also exert agency on society. We create a ripple effect through the way in which we form individuals and relationships, and the way that we activate agency within the family unit. So for my purposes, I really hope that, in our 5 weeks together, we can keep thinking about the possibilities and limits of that family as a center of formation. Pope Francis, when he was in the United States, he talked about families as factories of hope, or depending on how you translate the Italian, it's either factory or workshop of hope. I don't know which one I prefer, but this idea that this is the home of production, not just formation, ad intra for those individuals, but that formation has an impact on all the people who those family members encounter. And if we really think about the family as called to be transformed and to be transformative, I think there's a lot of purchase in how the church envisions the family and really tries to elevate it to have sway in even a sinful society. And then finally, we talked about families as icons or images of God. And, I worked through some of the religious artwork of the Holy Family in history and in modern day. And I think it's helpful, to think about our own families, to think about other families that we know, and to imagine them as icons of our triune God, who is love that is offered, received, and returned, even in difficult situations, even in the face of injury and illness, mental health issues, people losing their jobs, terrible tragedies. That in whatever state we find families, we still see God's presence and power in the world. So those were some of the highlights from last week, and I had a couple questions for us, and I'd love to know if you've given these any thought. What came to the surface for you? So my first question was invoking the example of the blind man Bartimaeus, where Jesus, I think, models such beautiful humility and curiosity. He doesn't presume to know what Bartimaeus wants, even though he's blind, even though he's sitting on the roadside begging, even though he's treated with scorn and shame. He invites Bartimaeus to lift his own voice and to be heard and to be known, and to activate not only his own dignity, but also his own agency by being able to say what he wants. And so I'm interested in, for all of you who've been thinking about this over the last week, if Jesus were to pose this question to your family or to other families that you know, or just a generic family today, what kinds of responses do you think Jesus would hear?
Always hesitate to answer, not being a married person with a family, but I interact often with parents in a school situation. And I guess, what do you want me to do for you? I'm thinking of parents today. If Jesus said, what do you want me to do for you? I think sometimes I would hear them say, discipline my kids, help them get values, and keep them on the straight and narrow because I can't do it. Society is too the headwinds of society and what is out there is just I can't keep up with this, and I just can't keep a handle on this. And these are good parents too, working, but still in the home. But uh finding the headwinds against uh keeping their children value centered is just a lot for a lot of these parents.
Yeah, thanks, Sister Maria. I think those are some of the things that we read in chapter 2, where Pope Francis is trying to be earnest in showing families he heard them in their survey responses. And there are a lot of families who talk about, really struggling with trying to raise their children well, and trying to help them overcome a lot of temptations, whether it's, just the seductiveness of digital technology and all the time people spend on screens. Even before the pandemic, parents were spending more time watching Netflix than they were interacting with their children. So it is a challenge. I always think of C.S. Lewis's book, The Screwtape Letters, which he wrote as a serial in the newspaper during World War II. Trying to provoke the conscience of his countrymen and countrywomen in Britain, where he talks. If you know the book, he's kind of inverting the way that we might think about Christian discipleship by having these letters between Wormwood, a demon in training, and his uncle Screwtape, a veteran demon who's accustomed to knowing how to deceive and distract and tempt people to kind of abandon God or find idols to replace worship or keeping God at the center of their life. And I often wonder what a Screwtape Letters volume would look like in 2024, especially just with technology and all the way that it just kind of makes us a slave to whatever's comfortable or convenient, or just whatever is entertaining, or just the way that it primes us for instant gratification. And those are hard temptations for adults. I can't even imagine what it's like for children whose brains haven't finished developing. So yeah, there's a lot there. And there's a lot of studies that are showing both that the screens are addictive. It's like digital heroin. And sometimes parents, because of how busy and stressed they are, they've got to hand a tablet to their child to help babysit the kid, which is tricky because then that can become like a security blanket, and actually be part of the way the brain gets wired. And on the other hand, how do you live without screens, right? Like, we can't be Luddites who just reject technology, or be Amish and think that we can find a way without screens, just because everything is increasingly getting mediated by a screen, just like our time together tonight. Arlene and John, you have your hand up.
Where did they go? You have to unmute, Arlene. Still mute.
Now, yeah, all right. They keep changing the Zoom on me. I had a hard time finding the reaction bar to begin with. Anyhow, I guess the reality is this too. I think we talk about the word family in too limiting a fashion sometimes. I think family winds up being more than just a husband and wife and a few kids. I think if we lose that perspective, we also lose a whole dimension. And I think that's part of what Francis is looking at in some ways, a wider dimension for the whole thing. That's one of my concerns.
Yeah, John, I appreciate you highlighting that, especially, in light of what Sister Maria just did, saying, well, who am I to weigh in on this because I'm not married and I don't have kids? We are all products of families, and we all belong to families, and that there isn't a cookie cutter, nuclear family, that it applies to some but not everyone. And so I do think that there's a need for us to really think more expansively about what it means to talk about families. And last week I mentioned that when I was reading through the survey results to the Lineamenta, the 47 question survey that the bishops put together, there were a lot of people who were frustrated with the way the church only seems to talk about families as parents and children, but not in any other way. You know, and that leaves a lot of people out, not just people who are single or couples without children, but widows, and just the way in which family is intergenerational. And you know, I think the invitation here is to think more in a communitarian way, and to not just think of family as limited to bloodlines, but in the way that we are called to recognize our kinship with one another as members of God's single human family. Jean, did you have something you wanted to add? We need you to unmute.
Yeah, gotta find
Good.
him.
There we go.
There
I
you
think
go.
last week we talked a little bit about people feeling hurt by church teaching and practices, and how many times Pope Francis has encouraged people to not feel excluded, not left behind, and
Mhm.
God's mercy and so forth. And yet Pope Francis always is cautious to say, we do this within the context of the church teachings and practices.
Mhm.
And, you know, as you were saying that, I was feeling a little bit, well, where is the hope in this? Because yes, God is merciful, but when we're trying to do all of this within church practices and teachings, we feel the rub. But then you said something at the end, which I would appreciate it if you could expand a little bit. You said, don't forget the church is the people of God also. And I thought that's where the hope is, really. Could you say a little more about that?
Yeah, thanks, Sister Jean. I mean, I think in our consumer society, we are tempted to think of the church like a place where sacraments get dispensed, and I show up if there's good music or good homily, or, you know, basically if I get something out of it. And I think a lot of people don't go to church unless they really are looking to be filled up, you know, kind of like a gas station where you go when the tank is on empty, and then you don't think about going back until the tank's on empty again. And I think instead of thinking of the church as only the clergy or the Vatican or even a brick and mortar building, I think it's really essential that we remind ourselves that we are the church, and by virtue of our baptism, every one of us is equal in importance as members of the church. And we've all been baptized priest, prophet, and king, which means that, you know, our faith and the way that we've been baptized and received into the body of Christ is not only a gift, it's also a task, which means that, again, you know, we've got work to do, and there's a responsibility of being church. So I'm with you. I think that is a reminder that we are all called to deliver on the church's mission, you know, to evangelize the world, to serve the world, to be a herald for society of what is possible if we really embrace the dignity of the human person, and to recognize that the person is intrinsically social with rights and responsibilities, and an inclusive sense of belonging. You know, you echoed the comment I made, where Pope Francis has really been stressing through the Synod on Synodality that he wants not only a listening church, but a church that leaves no one out and no one behind. That's not just something for Pope Francis to say. It's a calling for all of us to actually figure out, how do we do this? How do we create communities of belonging? And, you know, for the last 11 years, he's been talking about the need for us to build a culture of encounter, but that's the floor, not the ceiling. Encountering one another across differences and in a spirit of mercy or humility or curiosity, that's just the first step. And so I think what we need is to stop just talking about encounter. And that's not to say that's easy, right? Because there's so much polarization and social distrust and division. It's not an easy thing, but I think if we end at encounter, we fall way short of the kind of dialogue or the robust relationships that we see in the teaching and healing ministry of Jesus. Just like this encounter with Bartimaeus. After Bartimaeus is healed, Jesus says, go your own way, right? Like Jesus affirms Bartimaeus's dignity. And in the Gospel of Mark, it says that Bartimaeus, joined the Jesus movement. He was a follower of Jesus, part of that teaching and healing ministry. And so it's a task for us to be part of that mission and to build the communion of being church together, which, we have to find ways to do that, and not just on Sundays. If we're on our way to Mass or on our way home from Mass, we are the church everywhere we go and wherever we are. And I think that's important because, right now we're in a social context where for the first time in the history of the United States, fewer than half of Americans say they belong to a church. We're seeing, the rise of the nuns, people who are religiously disaffiliated. And sure, some of them have left the church, but the folks that I'm listening to, more often than not, they feel like the church has left them. That it is, as you were saying, Sister Jean, it's a church teaching or a practice. It's an example of hypocrisy or corruption or a lack of sensitivity that really leaves deep and lasting wounds. And this has impacted even my own family. My grandmother was Polish Catholic, and she fell in love with a Jewish man who was previously married and got divorced. And when she told her pastor that she had fallen in love with a Jewish man who was previously married and intended to marry him, the priest said, "You're going to hell," and kind of turned on his heel and walked away. She never really had any desire to return to the Catholic Church after that. I mean, it was just so hurtful. And I mean, obviously I wasn't there. I don't know if the priest meant that in all sincerity or not. But I think there are a lot of people who really do feel like the church has left them. And so it's easy for us maybe to point to an insensitive clergy person or a document that comes out of Rome and say, what's wrong with the church? But I think it's all on all of us to figure out what are we going to do to bring healing to the wounds that people carry and to do our part to prevent and redress the harm that's been done. Because in his letter to the Corinthians, St. Paul says that to be a disciple is to be Christ's ambassador of reconciliation. And so I think, that echoes what we read from the prophet Isaiah about being repairers of the breach. And so I think the hope for me, as I see it, is when people take seriously that they should be an artisan or an agent of reconciliation exactly where they are, because there are wounds everywhere we look. Peggy, was there something you wanted to add? Let's see if we can get you unmuted.
Got it. I got it. Okay. I'm unmuted now, right?
You are.
Okay, good. Okay. Look, I'm a sister in the church. So if you haven't been evicted and fired, I mean, we have wounds, but I think that we put too much on the clergy. They're sinful as we are. We're all sinful, but there is a beauty in the church, and I think it has. We justify my experience. We're justifying our alienation from the church by the sinfulness of the clergy. I mean, and I think it's terrible. We have been evangelized by the secular society. Instead of we're not evangelized, we are being evangelized. Mm-hmm. I see my students, their values, and I'm sure I'm affected by it too. But my point is that no matter what of the problem, it's the disguise of God. We have to keep on. We can't put all the problems on the church because we are the church. Sister Jean mentioned the thing about the people of God, which you said, but nobody gets more baptism than anyone else. Mm-hmm. We all have it. And we have to counteract this secularization that has crept into all of our lives. And I think we got to reboot and unpack the beauty of the church. The church is, we're the church.
Mhm.
And the beauty of marriage, the beauty of family, of course, there's the cross. We just came out of 6 weeks of looking at the passion of Christ. And we are also undergoing that in many ways. But I think that marriage is the greatest people I've ever met in my life. These married couples, and the families and the beauty of them and the sacrifices and love. So I think that I think we go forward with disguise and all. We're going forward with this faith and beauty of the marriage and family. And I think we have to go on positive and try to counteract this negativity and justification of not being affiliated with the church.
Yeah, thank you, Peggy. I think you're right. You know, and at the end of our time together last week, we talked about the scourge of clericalism, which is something Pope Francis has repeated a number of times over the last 11 years, just denouncing the way that we have elevated clergy, put them on a pedestal on the one hand, and then the flip side of clericalism is that it disempowers the laity. We expect priests to do everything for us or to be the church in our place. And so I think unless and until we do something about clericalism and we really embrace the gift and task of our baptismal vocation, the universal call to holiness, as the Vatican II documents describe, then we're going to stay stuck in a church where we see, church employees as service providers and the rest of us as service recipients. And we're going to be stuck in that consumer model that really is not at all the way that the Holy Spirit works, where gifts are dispersed to everyone in their station of life. All right, I don't want us to get too far behind tonight, so let's move on to chapters 2 and 3. So some highlights from chapter 2 as I see it. This is again Pope Francis trying to be earnest and showing the people who filled out that 46 question survey that he read their responses, that the bishops who gathered at the synod honored what they had to say. This is, I think, the chapter where Pope Francis is saying, I see you, I hear you, and the church is really trying to learn what it's like to be a family today. And as I mentioned before, that what's interesting to me is that in Amoris Laetitia, Pope Francis acknowledges that the church has contributed to some of the burdens that families carry. This is not something we saw a lot in the pontificates of John Paul II or Benedict XVI, where they did usually present the church as that perfect society, or as having the role of teacher without necessarily also being the learner. And so I think it is a gesture of humility on Pope Francis's part that he, in paragraph 36, he acknowledges the church's role in maybe adding stress. I mentioned the overemphasis on procreation. There were also a lot of couples who talked about the difficulties that they've had with church teaching on banning all forms of artificial contraception, to be open to the gift of life at all stages of a marriage, regardless of the, health and well-being, the financial security or state of that family. That is a cross for a lot of couples to bear. And we know, in the United States, roughly 95% of Catholic couples use artificial contraception at some point in their marriage. So this is not a teaching that has been well received. And in fact, going back to Humanae Vitae, Pope Paul VI overruled his lay advisors who told him in 1967, you can't tell couples they have to always be open to the transmission of life every time. That is an impossible standard to meet. So Pope Francis isn't going to change that ban on artificial contraception, but I think he's at least acknowledging that sometimes the church has not made things very easy on families. And then he quickly pivots to talking about the problems of society, and he's certainly very interested in a very narrow vision of freedom, where people are tempted to think of freedom as doing whatever I want, whenever I want, kind of a Peter Pan syndrome of never growing up, or never seeing that freedom is not just freedom from interference or imposition, but ultimately freedom is intended for self-gift. It's freedom for, to become the kind of person that I most deeply desire to be, to enter into the relationships that are fulfilling, that are modeled by mutual care and concern and co-responsibility. And then also, freedom for the common good, to create a social order where everyone has the conditions to flourish. And then also Francis laments the romanticized view of love, where people think that they're going to find their soulmate and be swept off their feet, and then it's going to be happily ever after, without really seeing that love is about sacrifice. Which is not to say that love is not about joy or hope, or being someone who delights in your spouse, or gets to be the object of someone else's delight. But he is really concerned about the decline of marriage around the world, but especially in the West, where people are quick to give up on marriage when it gets hard. That they see marriage in more of a transaction of, this is going to help me, or it's going to provide me financial security or stability, or it's going to provide me companionship so that I'm not lonely. We're seeing around the world a decline in marriage. And that's true in the United States, even though 95% of adults, so 95% of people who are over 18 either want to be married, are married, or have been married. So marriage is still an aspiration, at least in the United States, even though we're seeing, on average, just about half of all marriages end in divorce. Although in truth, that number is skewed by the percentage of second and third and fourth marriages that end in divorce, because there are people who serially get married and divorced, and aren't very good at the commitment dimension of love that is really important to Pope Francis. And he includes too the desire for children as part of God's design for marriage, as the way that God brings order to society, and the way in which marriage and family provides order for children. Psychologists tell us that children need love and stability. And when we have single parents or people who aren't faithful to each other, or whether there's a lot of instability in a household, it really, we see over and again that there are so many bad outcomes for the health and well-being of children, whether it's their mental health or their performance in school or their ability to secure stable employment or avoid premarital sex or drugs and alcohol. The Pope is on solid ground and really pointing to the wisdom of the Church and saying that marriage and family life is not only what society needs, but it's also what individuals need, so that they can be in relationships where they are shown that they are worthy of someone else's commitment. I think it's also worth highlighting, especially in light of Dignitatis Infinita that just came out a couple weeks ago, that in addition to decrying sexism and domestic violence, and I think Amoris Laetitia is probably the most the most we get of any pope who really denounces the problem of violence and the way that women in particular are subject to violence, of any church document. I can't think of any other church document that really makes explicit the scourge of violence and the way in which women are really subject to not just domestic violence, but violence in general. And we know in the United States that former or current romantic partners are the number one threat to women. And so I know that myself and a lot of other theologians are really grateful to see Pope Francis, finally, at long last, call out the sin of domestic violence. I mean, my whole life, I don't think I've ever heard a single homily on the problem of domestic violence. And as I shared, in our first session, I grew up in a pretty volatile and sometimes violent household, and to never have any homily call that out as wrong or as sinful, or to say that is something that needs to be acknowledged, and there needs to be remorse and an apology and a commitment to make amends. That's hard, when children or partners think that this is just part of what love entails, or someone's cross to bear, or because Jesus says we have to forgive 70 times 7, that means we keep turning the other cheek, because that's a good recipe for people to get turned into doormats and to enable toxic behavior. But in addition to this stress on the ways in which women and children suffer from domestic violence, then the Pope turns to raising questions about the ideology of gender, which is, as I see it, a little bit of a cumbersome or awkward phrase. I don't know that it's really an ideology. I think that, the best science that we have right now is telling us that sex is biological, right? And that's one thing, but gender is not so cut and dry. And I don't know that it's an ideology as much as it is informed in part by biology, but also part of culture and individual sensibilities. And there was a lot of hope for this Dignitas Infinita document, that it would show folks that the church has been listening, not just since Amoris Laetitia, but through the synods and synodality, especially when a lot of queer folk have been talking about the way that they have been wounded by the church, or the way that, the catechism says that a same-sex attraction is intrinsically disordered. I'm not sure that that's accurate from a scientific view, much less a theological view. And I mean, in 1994, when the Catechism was written, the science was a little bit less than clear, right? We weren't. I mean, at least Pope John Paul II says the genesis of same-sex attraction is unclear, and that may well have been true in the 90s. But now we know that for most people, sexual orientation is a genetic predisposition, like being right-hand dominant or left-hand dominant, or the color of someone's eyes. And so I think a lot of people have found, especially not just, what Pope Francis says in Amoris Laetitia back in 2015, this gender ideology, but even again, just a couple of weeks ago, to talk about it as an ideology rather than something that people are discerning, or that could eclipse the fact that, I mean, the beginning part of the document, Dignitas Infinita, it's not a very systematic document, unfortunately. It kind of runs all over, but the beginning part of it is really beautiful, talking about the innate and infinite dignity of the human person. But when we start to say that that's not true for everyone, or that some inclinations are intrinsically disordered, I think it makes it harder for people to see not only their own infinite and innate dignity, but to also recognize the infinite and innate dignity of every other person, no exceptions. And so I think that that's an example of where the church maybe still has some work to do, especially because we know, especially in this country, queer youth are disproportionately face disproportionate high rates of being bullied, of being abused at home and neglected at home. A disproportionately high rate of queer youth are homeless and not welcome at home. And then in other parts of the world, same-sex attraction is criminalized. And while the Pope has been real clear that it should not be criminalized, I think this is kind of like, when the church was trying to figure out what to do with Darwin's theory of evolution a couple centuries ago. I think that the church is still a little bit behind the learning curve on what scientists are telling us about sex and gender. So continuing on through chapter 2, there are several paragraphs dedicated to the sinful social structures that are making families suffer. And the Pope points out that families need more social support, like policies to help meet basic needs, including he talks about a family wage, which I think that phrase is really important because most domestic care is unpaid labor and it disproportionately falls to women. And there are a lot of women who do a lot of caretaking and never see a penny for all of that vital care in providing for very young children or perhaps an elderly relative. I know during the pandemic, I got a clear taste of this because my wife is a nurse and she had to go to the hospital every single day in the pandemic. And I was home with 3 kids and I also had to keep teaching. So I was trying to do, the job of a dad in addition to my job as a professor in the same time at the same place. And it was really, really hard. And I did the best I could, but it was, I think, it maybe added insult to injury that I was doing basically 2 jobs at once and only getting paid for one of them. So it was pretty eye-opening to me to kind of get a sense for all the unpaid domestic care that goes on around the world. And that family wage, I think, is important because as the Pope sees it, we need to make sure that the people who are working can provide for their families. And, they don't have to work multiple jobs just to keep food on the table or a roof over people's heads. Again, the Pope talks about protection from violence, sexual exploitation, and then denounces not just poverty in general, but the kinds of conditions that force so many people to flee their homes. And we can think of, just the instability of the global South that is causing a lot of migration, but also climate change. The UN estimates there's going to be 1 billion climate refugees by the year 2050, and there could be as many as 2 billion climate refugees by the year 2100. A lot of people that because of sea levels rising or because of deforestation or the desertification of land or the pollution of waterways, that they're going to be displaced from their homes. And that's going to cause chaos not only to families, but to entire societies. Then, the next part of chapter 2, there's some paragraphs looking at families just with a lot of complexity. And so here again, I think Pope Francis is trying to make sure that he shows families that he heard them. And the bishops at the synod really took seriously how the people who responded to the survey gave voice to just how challenging it is to care for very young children, children and adults with disabilities, elderly parents or loved ones. And then going to what Sister Maria said, just how hard it is to raise children well, to give them good values, to try to give them a sense of, a moral compass in a world that can be awfully toxic and, can make it really hard for students, for young people to like themselves or love themselves or, to embrace their own dignity and to recognize the dignity of others. There's a mention of technology and just, people just feeling like they don't have enough time. And then, also wanting to avoid the problems like addiction and violence. And then, in the wake of making sure that the Pope has made clear that he has heard what families have to say, he's kind of tipping his hand to where he wants to go in chapter 3 by kind of doubling down on saying, okay, the church is a font of moral wisdom. And in the face of all this instability and in the face of a toxic cultural anthropology, and in the face of, some moral relativism where people say things like, I do me, you do you, or we invoke tolerance, which can just basically be a cover for permissiveness. The Pope is saying, wait a second, maybe things are so chaotic and so hard because we haven't taken seriously the wisdom the church has been teaching about marriage and family. And so he calls for a renewal of marriage and family life and points out that marriage can be a dynamic path to personal development and fulfillment, trying to encourage people to consider marriage if they see it as an archaic institution. Or I mentioned last week, every spring I teach a class on marriage and family. for students at Xavier. And we use a beautiful book that you may really enjoy reading. It's called A Daring Promise, and it was written by the late, great Catholic theologian Richard Gallardi, who just passed away from cancer this past fall. And Gallardi gives us a really, I think, soaring vision of marriage that is intended to be really inspiring. But I'm amazed how many of my students just find it intimidating. I mean, they really think of monogamy for a lifetime as just being too high a standard to meet. And so in the face of people who are turning away from the institution of marriage, some people who think it's an archaic institution, or that it doesn't actually deliver on the promise for freedom and fidelity or flourishing, the Pope is saying that this is a way for people to be loved well and to love others well, with the hope that people open themselves to considering what marriage and family can provide them personally, and not just society or the church. So then, moving on to chapter 3, this is a very short chapter, and it honestly covers a lot of the material that we discussed last week. So I'm not sure that we need to belabor it here. In some ways, Pope Francis is moving through the See, Judge, Act process of trying to understand reality. And that's what he's doing with the second chapter. And then the third chapter, here he's trying to draw on scripture and tradition to say, okay, how can we make some moral judgments about what will best serve humanity and to help build a more humane society? And so I think you kind of get a taste of, this is Pope Francis's way of putting a new spin on Familiaris Consortio, or Casti Connubii from the 1930s, where he turns to Jesus and the way that marriage and family functions in the Gospels, not just to kind of rehearse what people have already read or what they might have been previously taught, but to remind us that Scripture is a narrative that is intended to kind of inform and transform the Christian imagination so that we expand what we imagine possible for ourselves and for the church today. And one of the lines that I think is really important is he reminds the church, all of us, but I think in particular here, his fellow clergy persons, to say that we have been called to form consciences, not replace them. And I think that's essential, because there are a lot of church leaders who do speak as if their word is the gospel truth. And we see this in the United States sometimes when we have clergy who start to endorse, political candidates, or who say, to vote Republican or Democrat is a sin. And that's certainly not in line with the USCCB document, Faithful Citizenship, which unfortunately has not been updated since 2007. And really, if anyone at the UCCB is listening, that document needs to get updated. But the church's role here is not just to help people how to vote or what to do or what kind of moral choices to make, but to help every person inform their conscience. And the conscience isn't Jiminy Cricket sitting on your shoulder whispering in your ear. It's not an angel on one side and the devil on the other. The conscience is not a thing so much as an innate capacity and a lifelong task in informing it for moral wisdom. And so I think with that understanding in mind, we can see that chapter 3 here is kind of the setup for the next 2 chapters. I think 3, 4, and 5 are really the heart of Amoris Laetitia. So next week, when we do chapters 4 and 5 together, I think that we'll kind of get the main points of what Pope Francis intends to say. But it's a reminder that people are obligated to follow their conscience and to continue to do the work of informing and forming and transforming their conscience throughout the entirety of their lives. Pope Francis also acknowledges that he wants to add a message of love and tenderness to what the church has taught about marriage and family. Otherwise, it can become just a defense of a dry and lifeless doctrine. I don't think he's trying to poke at Pope John Paul II here, but compassion and mercy are not mentioned at all in Familiaris Consortio. Pope John Paul II was a philosopher. He was certainly interested in love and responsibility, but there isn't a lot of pastoral care and concern to Familiaris Consortio. And so I think here Pope Francis is really trying to say, listen, if the family is called to anything today, it's to be a place where tenderness takes root. I know for me that is my prayer every time I'm at Mass and preparing to receive the Eucharist. My steadfast prayer is to be an instrument of tenderness for my spouse and my children. And I'm with Francis here. I think if the world needs anything, it's that revolution of tenderness that he called us to in Evangelii Gaudium back in 2013. I think, when we look at the wounds that are in church and society, I think a lot of it comes down to an absence of tenderness. And the Pope has presented the church as like a field hospital after battle. And I'm not quite sure that I love that image of the church because it's a triage model. I don't know that that's going to fit the scale of the problems that we're facing. You can't constantly be doing triage. At some point you've got to start strategizing for something that's more long-term or sustainable, or actually going to do some prevention and not just constantly trying to tend to the wounds. That the saying is prevention is the best medicine. But I think at least, going back to the culture of encounter being the floor, not the ceiling, I think that this revolution of tenderness is at least a good place to start. And then the rest of chapter 3 is rehearsing a lot of what we talked about last week, just presenting the sacrament of marriage as a gift and a calling, reminding us Christ is always present to aid in the process of loving and being loved, and a call to lifelong conversion to grow deeper in love. And again, that the fruit of that love is often found in children, although, for couples who struggle with infertility, or for couples who discern for whatever reason that bringing a child into the world is not right for them, that emphasis on the fruitfulness of marriage and tying it to biological procreation can be part of what harms people when we think of that command to be fruitful and multiply only through the lens of biological procreation. Going back to what you said, Sister Maria, I feel reluctant to share here because I'm not married and you don't have kids. That is not to say that you have not loved in a very fruitful way throughout your entire life. And so I think expanding our vision of fruitfulness to include children, certainly. My 3 children are the pride and joy of my life. Nothing makes me happier than to be with them. And also, I think love can be fruitful and generative in many ways, and not just limited to biological procreation. And I like these paragraphs too, where the Pope reminds us that every family, despite its weaknesses, can become a light in the darkness of the world. So there's, I think, a word of hope, going back to what Sister Jean had asked about before, reminding us that, this light, sometimes we're not sure that, who are we to be a light in the darkness, or where can we find the light so that we can be the light? So the connecting line there is the reminder that the light of Christ enlightens everyone, including those in an irregular union. So there was a lot of debate during the synod about whether and how to talk about couples that are together but aren't, in a recognized marriage in the church. And this is kind of the first time in church history we have this explicit acknowledgement of people who belong to the church, to whom Christ is present, and also at the same time, I have a lot of friends and colleagues too who are theologians, and that term irregular union, or later in the document we'll see an allusion to families in irregular situations. it does still feel kind of awkward and clumsy. And there are a lot of people who think that it is problematic because it refers back to the problem that John identified a while back of just thinking of family and kind of that nuclear sense of, a heterosexual couple with their biological children. And if you don't fit that mold, then you're not included. Arlene and John, you have your hand up. What did you want to add?
You have to unmute. Marcus, can you unmute them?
Unmuted.
Well,
There you go.
There we go.
All right. Okay.
You get this down.
That the latest document on, human dignity that came out,
Mhm.
I think the church always shoots itself in the foot.
Mhm.
And part of that is they don't take science
Mm.
and incorporate that into what they're trying to say. There's a lot of good parts in that, but when I was talking to a number of people, we're working on trying to do a presentation in October for educating the residents here about LGBTQ plus issues.
Mhm.
And so we're going to start this subcommittee. But the thing is, I thought this would be a good document to read because there are many people who are Catholic here.
Mm.
You have to know where people are coming from when you're trying to talk or explain things to. But anyway, they felt that, oh God, this is just going to reinforce people's mentality on this issue. And in a sense, there are so many good things in it, but that gets overlooked because of this. I like to think of it as like, a scab that we keep on picking on, and we don't let it heal. We don't, I don't know. It just seems like when you were talking too about conscience, we don't really encourage people to follow their conscience. The church wants to be in charge, wants to call the shots, and while many efforts have been made in trying to incorporate what the laity thinks, then it comes back down to this is what I say, this is what is. And I don't know, I'm rambling, but it just seems like it's a big problem, and it's many people are just young people that they say are really kind of turned off. And again, we seem to be into this binary, what is sacred, what is secular. We don't see the continuity of things.
Mhm.
I don't know. I guess I'm in a bad spot tonight.
No, I appreciate what you have to share, Arlene, and I think I think the common view, the consensus, is that Dignitas Infinita is a step in the wrong direction, and has undone a lot of the good faith efforts that people thought were finding traction, especially in the Synod on Synodality. And I think too, Sister Maria, of the work that you did with Spirit Alive, this past year on sexuality and the sacred, some of those presentations were just, brilliant and prophetic. And there are a lot of really very sharp minds at work on how can we work with the tradition. Not throw the baby out with the bathwater or just say very simplistically that the church is wrong, but to do it in a much more nuanced way. And I think that's what really hurts with Dignitas Infinita is that, all of these theologians who've been working really hard to try to think about, how do we honor what the church has taught, but then also, as you say, Arlene, right, like do theology in light of the best science we have in front of us. And this seems to be a rejection not only of of the science that we have, but just what people have been telling the church, especially coming from the queer community, or also, friends and family of queer folk. There are so many programs dedicated to parents of LGBTQ youth, or siblings of people who are queer, who also carry a level of betrayal to say, it hurts my heart that that my loved one has to look over their shoulder because they're worried about getting fired because they work for the church, or that my my niece or nephew can't receive the sacrament because they have two moms or two dads. They're not welcome at First Communion. And in the same way that the church teaching on couples who get divorced and remarried feel unwelcome to participate at Eucharist, it goes back to that line that I brought in last week, about the Eucharist not being a prize for the perfect, but medicine for the weak, and we're all weak. And so I think, here again in this document, we see the church, to borrow your phrase, Arlene, shooting itself in the foot by saying, on the one hand, all are welcome at the table, for the Eucharist. And on the other hand, you people over here, you've succumbed to this gender ideology, and you think you know better than what the church has said about sex and gender, and you're wrong. It does, at the very least, it feels very inconsistent with what Pope Francis has been trying to do over the last 11 years. Sister Maria.
Yeah, just in a slightly different way, but I was looking at it. The sacrament of marriage is a gift and calling, a vocation. And you just look at the society today. I mean, very few people have a notion of vocation or believe that God is calling them, or that there's a providential direction for their lives. So I think that's a huge hurdle to go over. There was an article in the New York Times just a couple of weeks ago where a guy said, I forget the title of it, but he was asking young people, like, what are your plans for your life? Meaning, what are the things that are going to engage you? And he was shocked because it was all about making money, having two Lexuses in the garage, and kind of being extremely materialistic. And if you have that orientation, which we have in our consumer society, understanding marriage as a vocation is no. And it doesn't fit in the plan, because it's a lot of autonomous self-direction. That's the one thing I was thinking. The second thing is, while you were talking before about, marriage and, the difficulties facing married people, and just the headwinds against marriage, I started jotting down, and I thought, in religious life, you can't make vows before 6 years of formation. In priesthood, you need 4 years of college plus 4 years of theology. So that's like 8 years and 6 years. And you need 8 hours of pre-Cana to qualify for marriage. So you think it's absurd. It's absurd that this is a sacrament. It's a vocation. And we are willing to say, as a church, if you are a hapless, mindless 25 or 26-year-old still into consumer society, but your parents are telling you should get married in the church, if you do 8 hours of pre-Cana, which you can now do online. I mean, they advertise that they make it convenient for you to be able to pursue your, job on Wall Street and do your 8 hours. I mean, there is such a radical disconnect between what we are saying is the immensity of this vocation in terms of what individuals are going to derive from it in terms of personal fulfillment and holiness, and how important this is for society. And you can get married with 8 hours of pre-Cana. I mean, it's kind of, it makes no sense to me, Marcus. And I think the church is at fault in this whole conversation about marriage. I think the church has failed to really seriously instruct people in what marriage is about, and lets people just, we give, like you said, we give a harder time to practicing Catholic lesbians who want to baptize their children than non-practicing people who pro forma 8 hours of pre-Cana and they get married in the church. What are your thoughts on that? Have you ever, looked at that and
Well,
said,
two things. So, I mean, on your first point about how countercultural the vocation of marriage is, I think that's true, and I don't know how a same-sex couple who wants to make that commitment in all earnestness is a threat to the institution of marriage. I mean, I see that as only reaffirming that there is something really deeply attractive about making those vows in public, in front of your friends and family, and calling on the power of the Holy Spirit to say, I need all the help I can get to live these vows day in and day out. And on the second point, I do think there is a problem with the church's approach. I would say to all sacramental prep. I mean, I worked as a youth minister for 4 years before I pursued my master's and PhD at Boston College. And I think a lot of ways we treat, like, for example, the sacrament of confirmation kind of like the bar mitzvah, of just saying, like, this is how we recognize you as an adult in the church. And a lot of people just, think of it like a toll booth where, okay, I hit this milestone and now I'm done and I can choose whether or not I want to participate in any part of the church afterwards. And I think similarly with the sacrament of marriage, we overemphasize the hoops to jump through so that you can get married in the church. And then there's almost zero support for married couples once they've gotten married. I mean, my fear is if we do more than those 8-hour minimums, then people are just going to say, forget it. I was just going to get married in the church for my parents or my grandparents anyway, and then they'll get married on the beach or in a courthouse or wherever they want. I mean, marriages in churches are way down to begin with. But on the other hand, people often say that your first year of marriage is either your best or your worst. And in my case, it was certainly the hardest. I mean, I married a woman who's an only child, who never really had to share anything in her entire life. And there was a lot of adjustments, for both of us, I'm sure, especially because she was a nurse who was working second shift and I was trying to build a youth ministry program and I was working 80 hours a week. I mean, we thought because we did the pre-Cana and because we loved each other, that was going to be enough. And we had no idea that marriage is something radically different than when you're dating in college. And so I would say pre-Cana did not prepare us at all for the highs and lows of marriage. Like we didn't have any conversations about miscarriage and how painful it is to be excited for, to bring a child into the world and then to have that taken away from you. And then how to, the grief of losing a child, and how to talk about it. I mean, 1/4 of all pregnancies end in miscarriage. But again, in my entire life, I've never heard a single homily about miscarriage and just the grief that corresponds with that. And I mean, how do you bring up that topic without looking like a Debbie Downer, and to say, oh, by the way, yeah, we're not doing so well because, we had our hopes dashed. But so, yeah, I mean, I think you're pointing to a lot of work that needs to be done. And I think, here we can connect back to what Sister Jean was saying about all of us being the church. Working in a parish setting for 4 years, I can tell you, parish staff are overworked and underpaid. I mean, I was working 80 hours a week. I was making $30,000 a year. It almost cost me my marriage because, how do you say no to a teenager who wants to meet with you or who wants to, go on a service program, or who's asking for more programming, like. I was convinced that I was bringing teens to Christ, and that was the greatest good. And it came at the expense of taking care of myself and making time for my wife. But when you're working in a parish, having boundaries or having any work-life balance is really, really hard. And I think this is a place where taking seriously this idea that we are a family of families. There's a lot of wisdom from married couples and to have, married couples who've been together for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, 30 years, 50 years, to have them kind of mentor younger couples through the highs and lows of married life, or in moments of crisis. I mean, it is a little bit silly that for so long we've kind of thought that, like, when you're having trouble, you go to the parish priest and you talk about it, because the one guy who's celibate and not married is supposed to be an expert about life in every circumstance. I mean, my best friend is a priest, so I'm not trying to throw shade on priests. You know, he's a product of a family, so he knows a little bit of marriage from his 3 siblings who are married. But you know, it's kind of like Karl Rahner's vision of the church. There, you know, Karl Rahner said that the church is beautiful, just like stained glass windows are beautiful. They're only beautiful from the inside. I think it's kind of similar with marriage. You know, to have clergy be experts on marriage or to be marriage counselors is a little bit silly, given that you don't really understand it unless and until you're really looking at it from the inside. And so, you know, that would be an opportunity, maybe not just you know, in rethinking how to do pre-Cana, but also how do we better support married couples and families in general, not just married couples, but, you know, after the wedding day. Because especially in our consumer society, there's so much buildup to the wedding day. I mean, the average wedding in this country costs more than $30,000. It is obscene that people are going into debt to throw a party on their wedding day. And then, you know, after that, in terms of actual support, there's just so little. Okay, so
I think
yeah,
there are 2 comments in the chat.
oh, and we're running out of time. How did that happen? I thought I was so
Yeah.
much better this time around by
That's okay.
paring down what I wanted to talk about. So yeah, Katya has a couple points in the chat. Some few churches offer pastoral accompaniment for the first 5 years. Oh, that's great to hear. I have not seen that, but pastoral accompaniment for the first 5 years for newly married couples is certainly great. More pastoral accompaniment, I think, of all people. I mean, I have so many friends who are single and they feel like the church is only interested in them when they're in their 20s as a way to, like, get them to meet someone else who's single and then get married and have kids. But if you're single in your 30s or your 40s or your 50s or your 60s, you're just invisible to the church. But Katya, thanks for those examples. And I do like your point there about celebrating significant marriage anniversaries in the church. We absolutely should, you know, find more ways to celebrate the milestones. And as we talked about last week, we don't have many examples of saints who are married. I think the church could do a way better job of really delivering on a vision of that, the universal call to holiness, as something that we can see modeled in family life, and not just you know, these individuals who had incredible conversion stories.
Okay.
Well, we are at time. So how about, like last week, I'll propose these questions for you, and then maybe you can ruminate with them for a couple days, and then next week we can pick up here. So the 3 questions I came up with were first, Pope Francis tries to strike a balance between seeing the church as a teacher, but also trying to learn from families. So, asking you to think about, what does the church still need to learn so that it can more effectively impart wisdom to families. Thomas Aquinas says, all good communication is according to the mode of the receiver. And I do worry that the church, in relying on encyclicals or apostolic exhortations like Amoris Laetitia. I mean, this document is almost 400 paragraphs long. How many people are actually going to break it open and read it? I mean, no one has time for that unless you're a Catholic moral theologian like me. So how do we try to impart wisdom in a way that it can be more effectively received? So I for my money, I think that starts with listening. And then I think secondly, we've read a lot tonight and talked about, these sinful social structures. And I think it's easy for the church to denounce them, but also then thinking about, what else does the church need to do to galvanize greater resistance to social problems, so that we're mobilizing Christians to not just resist the sinful social structures, but to try to dismantle them. And then third, we skipped over some paragraphs where Pope Francis talks about marriage as both natural and supernatural. And for my students, this is something that really intrigues them. You know, that marriage is a civil institution, but also has this sacred dimension. You know, for a lot of people, marriage is just a function of economic security, or a tax break, or something that, you know, because you've been living together, common law, you know, if we've been cohabitating this long, we might as well get married, you know, just almost an inevitability rather than an intentional discernment or a vocation. And so I think the church probably needs to nuance this a little bit more, because I imagine there are a lot of people who are married who don't see their marriage as an icon of the Trinity or of the Holy Family, or who aren't attentive and responsive to the grace that's at work in the way that they offer and receive love. And I wonder if there's a way in which, you know, going back to the evangelization we were talking about earlier tonight, is there a way that, you know, even for those people who see their marriage through a secular lens, the church could invite them to be more reflective and to look at the way that they have been touched or transformed in their loving, and maybe be more attentive to the ways in which God is at work in their loving union. You know, I think of that line, you know, bidden or not bidden, God is here. We don't have to invite God in for God to be at work in a loving relationship. And so for my money, I think it would be worth thinking about given the rising rates of people who are separating themselves from the institutional church, you know, not to think of evangelization or conversion as you need Jesus or come to Jesus, or we're going to bring Jesus to you, but maybe Christ is a part of your life and you just haven't been paying attention.
A wonderful, wonderful thought to conclude with, because I think that could be something for all of us to think about. So, you know, we live in a world right now that is on the verge of so much devastation, atrocities, war, Israel's decision. So maybe we can just end tonight by calling on the Creator God who made this creation and gave it to us to care for, to help expunge the hatred in human hearts, and move us and our leaders towards peace and reconciliation for the good of God's creation. And we ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen.
And
Good night, everybody. See you then.
Right.
Thank you. Thank you, Marcus.
my
So
pleasure.
much this could have gone on for like a couple of hours. Thank you. So much to think about. Good night, Arlene and John. Good night, everyone
Right.
who's
Night.
joined us tonight. Great to see you.
I think so.
See you next week.